After enduring centuries of unspeakable hardships and dehumanizing conditions under slavery, African Americans finally saw the end of this brutal institution with the abolition of slavery. However, the victory was bittersweet. What followed was a new era of systemic oppression designed to keep black people in a state of economic disadvantage and political suppression. Through a combination of laws and societal norms, African Americans were pushed to the margins, stripped of basic human rights, and relegated to the status of second and even third-class citizens. Housing segregation was strictly enforced, confining black communities to separate, often impoverished neighborhoods far from their white counterparts. This segregation extended to every aspect of life: education, public spaces, dining establishments, recreational facilities, and even places of worship were all divided by race. In many cases, these rules were backed by powerful institutions and white individuals who harbored the misguided belief that such isolation would eventually result in the decline and disappearance of the black population. But contrary to these oppressive efforts, the resilience of the black community only strengthened. Rather than diminishing, African Americans found ways to thrive. They built vibrant communities, invested in education, and steadily increased their land ownership and wealth. In the face of overwhelming odds, they persevered, creating lasting legacies and contributing significantly to the cultural, economic, and social fabric of the nation. Laws, along with racist individuals and institutions in the United States, orchestrated sweeping and calculated efforts to strip African Americans of their hard-earned land and wealth. As a result, the generational wealth that black communities had painstakingly accumulated over decades was systematically confiscated, creating and perpetuating the stark wealth gap between black and white populations. But how did this happen so quietly, so insidiously, and yet so systematically? Let's delve into this untold part of black history, one that is often missing from mainstream American history books. According from the early 20th century, African Americans collectively owned an impressive 14 million acres of land. Tragically, this land was stolen through a series of racially motivated tactics and legal loopholes designed to disempower black landowners. Structural racism made it possible for this theft to appear lawful, convincing many that it was not only justified but necessary. However, the real motive behind these actions was far more sinister. It was not about legality or justice, but about consolidating wealth and power in the hands of white supremacists. They sought to control the economic and political landscape by seizing land that rightfully belonged to African Americans. This systematic dispossession contributed to the significant racial wealth gap that persists today. And it's a critical chapter of black history that must be acknowledged and taught as part of the broader American story. As we entered the 21st century, a staggering 90% of the original 14 million acres once owned by African Americans had been unjustly stripped away. Today, African Americans hold just 1.1 million acres of farmland, with partial ownership of an additional 1.07 million acres. This dramatic loss of land was no accident, but rather the result of deliberate and systematic efforts by white landowners, farmers, and developers who used a variety of tactics to dispossess black families of their land. Over the course of a century, these actions eroded the wealth that black landowners had painstakingly accumulated over generations. The legal system, along with discriminatory practices, allowed white individuals to exploit loopholes, often through unscrupulous means, to wrest control of land from African American farmers and homeowners. Following the Civil War, many black Americans had become landowners under the Homestead Act, which allocated roughly 20 million acres of land, mostly in the South. These landholdings had the potential to serve as a foundation for building generational wealth for African Americans in the post-Jim Crow era. However, instead of fostering prosperity for black families, this land primarily enriched white supremacists. Through violent and brutal means, white landowners and vigilantes orchestrated a campaign of terror aimed at either forcibly removing black families from their land or intimidating them into abandoning it. This violent machinery was designed to eliminate black landholders and further exacerbate the racial wealth gap. One harrowing example occurred in Birmingham, Kentucky, during the early 20th century. The town, which had a predominantly black population and was a center for tobacco production, became a target for white supremacist violence and land seizures. In 1908, a group of armed white vigilantes known as the Night Riders launched a terror campaign on the town, resulting in the deaths of several black residents. Property records from the time revealed that 14 black landowners lost over 60 acres of farmland in 21 city lots, often through sham sheriff sales at obscenely low prices. These losses represent just one instance of the broader, calculated efforts to deprive black communities of their wealth and land, efforts that have left a lasting legacy of economic inequality. This part of black history, often overlooked, is a stark reminder of the systemic oppression that African Americans have endured and the profound impact it has had on generational wealth in the United States. In Pierce City, Missouri, yet another horrifying act of racial terror unfolded on August 18, 1901. On that day, a mob of 1,000 armed white individuals set fire to 5 houses owned by black residents, resulting in the tragic deaths of 4 black individuals. In the aftermath of this brutal attack, the town's entire black population, 129 people in total, fled in fear, never to return. This mass exodus was a direct result of the terror and violence inflicted upon them. Shockingly, according to reports from the Associated Press, 9 black residents of Pierce City lost a total of 30 acres of farmland in 10 city lots. These properties were subsequently purchased by white individuals at heavily discounted prices, contributing to the growing racial wealth gap. One of the victims, Evelyn Brinson, whose home was among those torched by the mob, eventually sold her lot for a mere $25 to a white woman after the traumatic attack. This incident highlights a devastating pattern. Black people were often coerced into giving up their land, forced to choose between their lives and their property. Many, under the constant threat of lynching or violence, had no choice but to surrender their land for a fraction of its value. Lynchings and mob attacks targeting black individuals were frequently followed by mass evacuations of entire black communities. Under immense pressure, both from local authorities and white citizens, black landowners were often forced to abandon their homes or sell their land at drastically undervalued prices, effectively turning them into refugees within their own country. One such grim example took place in Ocoee, Florida, in 1920. Following an Election Day attack on the black community, 18 black families were forced to flee, resulting in the loss of 330 acres of land and 48 city lots. In some cases, individual black farmers faced more targeted assaults by groups of white farmers, known as the White Caps, operating in several southern and border states during the early 20th century. These groups aimed to drive black landowners from their property and discourage other black individuals from acquiring land. This violent and systematic land theft not only robbed African Americans of their property but also deprived future generations of the wealth and stability that land ownership can provide. These atrocities, often omitted from mainstream historical narratives, reveal the deep and enduring impacts of systemic racism in America. The legacy of stolen land and wealth continues to shape the racial economic divide today, making it imperative to remember and reckon with these painful chapters in U.S. history. The Whitecaps often resorted to terror tactics to intimidate black landowners, including leaving threatening notes with crudely drawn coffins on their doors, warning them to leave or face deadly consequences. A particularly tragic example involved Eli Heilson, a farmer in Lincoln County, Mississippi. On November 18, 1903, Heilson received one of these warnings. Ignoring it, he continued with his life, but a month later, as he was driving his buggy toward his farm, the 39-year-old was fatally shot. His horse returned home with his lifeless body, delivering the grim news to his wife, Hannah. Left to care for their 11 children and manage their 74-acre farm, Hannah struggled to maintain the property. In 1905, after defaulting on their mortgage, the farm was foreclosed and sold for just over $400 to S.B. Oliver, a county supervisor. Today, that land is worth tens of millions of dollars, representing a devastating loss of generational wealth. But the Whitecaps and Night Riders were not the only forces driving black families from their land. Corruption within the legal system often played a role as well. In Yazoo County, Mississippi, twin brothers Norman and Homer Stevens ran a trucking business that transported cotton pickers to plantations. In 1950, a white farmer demanded that the Stevens brothers immediately deliver workers to his field. However, with prior commitments, Norman Stevens promised to send the laborers later. The farmer, enraged, called the local sheriff. That night, the Stevens brothers were jailed, locked in a second-floor room. Fearing for their lives, they overheard the sheriff discussing plans to conceal their bodies. The brothers managed to escape by leaping from the window and fleeing into the night. Following this harrowing experience, the Stevens brothers flagged down a bus heading to Ohio, and a year later, Rosie Fields, Norman's wife, along with their 5 children, joined them. For a decade, they continued to make mortgage and tax payments on the home they had left behind, as documented in county records. But eventually, the financial strain became too great, and in the 1960s, they stopped making payments, losing the house they had purchased for $700 in 1942. When violence proved insufficient to force black landowners off their properties, other methods were employed. Legal barriers, such as unfair taxation, became tools of disenfranchisement. Tax sales provided an avenue to take land from black property owners, often under false pretenses. White tax assessors frequently inflated the assessed value of black-owned land, resulting in exorbitant tax bills. Unable to pay, black landowners were forced to sell their land at auctions, further enriching white elites at the expense of black communities. These stories reflect a broader history of systemic efforts to strip African Americans of their land and wealth. This theft has had lasting consequences, contributing to the stark racial wealth gap that exists today. By remembering these painful chapters of history, we can better understand the deeply rooted inequalities in the U.S. and the importance of addressing them. If you're passionate about uncovering these untold stories and learning more about the true history of racial inequality in America, please support our channel by subscribing and giving this video a like. Together, we can build a strong community dedicated to sharing the truth. Thank you for your support. Let's continue. Thus, black people living in the same towns as white residents often found themselves paying disproportionately higher taxes. This discriminatory practice, intentionally imposed by local authorities, gradually eroded the income of black families, making it increasingly difficult to maintain financial stability. In instances where black-owned property appreciated in value or when a black property owner openly challenged the prevailing white supremacist order, local officials could simply declare the property tax delinquent and auction it off. For many black property owners, land was not just a financial asset but a symbol of independence and generational wealth, something they fought hard to retain. However, with most families surviving on fixed or limited incomes, covering the ever-increasing property taxes became an overwhelming challenge. Once they were unable to pay, their properties would be listed for auction, often at below-market prices. Opportunistic developers saw this as an opening, using legal loopholes to acquire valuable land that families were otherwise unwilling to sell. A particularly poignant example of this exploitation is the story of Evelina Jenkins, a native of the South Carolina Sea Islands. Her family had held onto their land for generations, resisting external pressures to sell despite frequent financial hardships. However, like many others, Evelina found it increasingly difficult to keep up with the taxes on her family's land, especially as its value rose, making her a target for developers seeking to acquire the property at a fraction of its worth. Ms. Evelina Jenkins owned numerous acres of land, including an entire island. During the early 1970s, a time when property values along South Carolina's coastline were soaring. Tragically, despite holding such valuable assets, Ms. Jenkins was a victim of the state's chronic underinvestment in education for people of color. As a result, she received minimal schooling and never learned to read. Decades of disenfranchisement, compounded by white control over local government and the courts, led her to believe that the rights and protections offered by these institutions were not meant for her. The idea of stepping into local government offices to register licenses or pay taxes meant subjecting herself to mistreatment and humiliation, experiences she desperately sought to avoid. Because of this, Ms. Jenkins entrusted a white neighbor, who had befriended her, with the task of delivering her annual property tax payments to town on her behalf. But instead of submitting the payments, this neighbor betrayed her trust by pocketing the money. He waited until her taxes became delinquent, then purchased the lien to her property at the county's annual tax auction. After the statutory redemption period expired, he gained full ownership of her landholdings, including the island she had worked so hard to keep. In the decades that followed, the land that once belonged to Ms. Jenkins generated significant wealth. Homes on the island that she had owned now sell for well over $400,000. Tragically, Ms. Jenkins never saw any of this prosperity. Instead of leaving a valuable inheritance to her children, she died penniless, spending her final days in her daughter's mobile home. While Ms. Jenkins' story is exceptionally heartbreaking, it was far from unique. The legal appropriation of Black-owned land through deceit, tax sales, and other exploitative means was a common occurrence in rapidly developing real estate markets like Hilton Head and the surrounding sea islands. These tax sales provided opportunistic investors with a means to acquire highly valuable property at a fraction of its true worth, continuing a cycle of wealth extraction from African American communities. The tragic loss of land, combined with the systemic barriers that prevented Black families from benefiting from their own property, contributed to the racial wealth gap that persists today. Another method used to dispossess Black families of their land was the exploitation of the Torrens Act. Originally developed in Australia in 1858 by Sir Robert Torrens, this system was designed to strengthen land ownership certainty and simplify property transactions. When introduced in the United States, the Torrens Act was intended to streamline the process of registering property titles. However, it inadvertently created a loophole that allowed third parties to forcibly strip Black families of their land through a practice known as partition sales. Partition sales became a tool for land theft when multiple co-owners of a property held shared ownership. But one individual wished to sell while others did not agree. Under the Torrens Act and related regulations, these sales could proceed without the knowledge or consent of other family members or co-owners. Crucially, once the sale was finalized, the legal protections built into the Torrens system shielded the buyer from any challenges by co-owners who were either unaware of the sale or had opposed it. This loophole was exploited to devastating effect. Black families, often holding property through shared generational ownership, were disproportionately targeted. One family member might be pressured or deceived into selling, allowing white developers or land speculators to seize full control of the land through partition sales, with no recourse to challenge the legality of the sale under the Torrens system. Black landowners lost not only their property but also any hope of reclaiming it through legal channels. These partition sales were particularly damaging in areas with significant Black land ownership, as they systematically drained wealth from African American communities. What should have been a system to protect land ownership instead became a tool for furthering economic disenfranchisement, eroding Black generational wealth and contributing to the racial wealth gap that persists to this day. Another method used to exploit Black landowners was through the manipulation of the Harris Property Act. This law typically applied to family-owned land that had been passed down through multiple generations without undergoing formal legal procedures to conclusively establish ownership. When property owners died without leaving a clear legal title, their heirs might possess the property, but they lacked the necessary documentation to prove ownership definitively. This lack of formal title created significant vulnerabilities. While the heirs could live on and use the land, they were often unable to sell it, secure loans using the land as collateral, or protect it from legal challenges. The absence of a clear title also increased the risk of losing the property, either through partition sales or failure to pay property taxes. As generations passed, the number of heirs and co-owners of such property often grew significantly, making land management even more complex. With so many co-owners, it became difficult to track down every family member to get their consent for land transactions. This complexity left heirs' property particularly vulnerable. Even if some family members wished to retain the land, others could choose to sell their share, triggering a partition action that would force the sale of the entire property. White developers frequently exploited these legal complexities, taking advantage of family miscommunication or disagreements. Partition sales were a common tactic used to acquire heirs' property, often at a fraction of its true market value. The displaced family members, many of whom had no say in the sale, were left with little or no compensation. This legal maneuver enabled speculators to compel the sale of millions of acres of black-owned land over several decades, contributing to the erosion of black wealth. Now imagine if black people had been able to retain the wealth and land they once owned. How different would things be today? Would the black population be thriving in the U.S., free from the systemic disadvantages they face? Speak out and let us know your thoughts on the systematic robbing of black people's wealth and land in the comments section below. If you'd like us to continue making more videos that explore these crucial aspects of history, please support us by subscribing to the Licking the Bell icon. Check out our other videos on the channel as well for more in-depth insights.